Right now here on the channel, I'm working on building this custom slot-ported subwoofer enclosure. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, oftentimes when I'm building these custom boxes, I like to add little details that kind of tie the enclosure to the rest of the vehicle. Sometimes these details are quite elaborate, and other times they're just simple little details that tie to the design characteristics that we see throughout a vehicle interior. Now, usually when I'm adding those details, I'm doing different woodworking tasks, most frequently using something like a woodworking router in order to make these different shapes and geometry that get affixed to the enclosure. But in this video, we're gonna try something a little bit different with 3D printing. These 3D printed pieces that we're going to add are not the most crazy design ever. Actually, they're relatively simple. We're going to talk more about the design of this, but this is intentional. I just want to kind of do an experiment here and see how this works, especially with applying some of the different coatings that I like to use when I go to finishing these custom enclosures. My other goal for this video is to continue along in our process and basically have the enclosure ready for the subwoofers to be mounted into it. So to kick off talking about our design, we need to look to the vehicle to look for some different design cues. This particular vehicle is a Jeep Wrangler JL, but I do want to stress to you guys that everything I'm talking about here can be applied to any vehicle. The point of my videos is not to copy exactly what I'm doing step by step, but rather see the overall process that I go through when I come up with these different designs. Now on this particular box, when it is installed in the vehicle, it comes to about this line right about here, which means you can still see these side ribs that are located on each side of the vehicle. If you weren't able to tell already, this enclosure is obviously quite large, and that's because the design goal of this enclosure is to have a considerable amount of output. I mention this because we always want to consider the application when it comes to designing a car audio system. If we were going for more of an end goal to have an accurate level of bass reproduction, we could obviously use smaller subwoofers and have a smaller enclosure, which would allow us to more easily tie in with the design of the vehicle. But in this case here, it's a large box and we are trying something new, so I don't want to go overboard with the amount of different pieces that I'm creating. So I'm really just focusing on this design aesthetic here. I really want these lines to kind of carry over into my enclosure once it's installed in the vehicle. So I did take a bunch of dimensions here, the most important dimensions being from the floor to where this line starts, and then the spacing between the two, along with the thickness of each of these ribs, along with some focus on the end design of them here. So just some quick dimensions like this, and now I'm able to head on over to my design computer. Really quick, before we get into our 3D model design, something else that's really handy to design on the computer is our car audio system, and for that I like to use our show sponsor Crutchfield. Obviously when it comes to car audio gear, there are tons of different options, and what I love about the Crutchfield website is how easy it is to narrow down something that is perfect for my application. As an example on subwoofers, let's say I want to narrow down based off of my budget and also my subwoofer size, but also the rated power that I want to use. This is very easy to do. I can also select a few different options and use the compare tool to easily compare all of the different specs. Even better yet, you can save on your next car audio purchase with the special offer for car audio fabrication fans. Learn more at the link down in the video description. So here we are in our design software, and I know you guys are going to ask, so I designed this using Fusion 360. I want to give you guys a look at the finished design before we work through the process real quick here. Everything always begins with an initial sketch, and in this case I wanted to draw what I'm going to be modeling on top of, which is the front of the enclosure, which is 18 inches by 38 inches, and I've also got the port geometry drawn in there. I extruded that sketch in order to make that in 3D. Next, I wanted to add some of the real-world roundovers to the front of the port. That way I just have a realistic spacing from this edge of the roundover here to the edge of the board. And now I was looking to actually design and model the shape of our first little rib here. Now you'll probably recall that 7 1/8 inch dimension, that's from the bottom of the enclosure to the center line of where I measured that rib in the vehicle. I drew in a construction line here so that I could base my design off that same real world spacing. And you can see I basically just created this initial shape here, which has a width of a 1/2 inch. And I also took some real world measurements of that tab style design that exists in the vehicle and matched those with these measurements here. And to give our design more of a unique look, rather than just having a straight rib, I decided to add this slight 30-degree angle here at the end that extends for about 4 inches. And I did add some radiuses onto those corners to smooth things out. From here, we extruded that initial shape. And then I decided that I wanted to soften up some of these hard corners here, which I did with some chamfers. Next, I wanted to add a chamfer around the full outside perimeter of the shape. So I did that with this design feature here. And then it was time for creating another sketch on the inside pocket here. I basically decided that I want to add a pocket just to do something a little bit more unique. Up until now, this is a shape that could be easily created using the woodworking techniques with some different templates, but I wanted to add something that made this a little bit more unique for 3D printing, so I made this pocket. This pocket is actually going to be a cut into the piece. So if we finish our sketch here and we do that extrusion, you can see it cuts down in. And then rather than having these sharp, tight corners on the inside here, I also wanted to add a chamfer there as well. Now, this is one of the big advantages of parametric modeling. Rather than needing to create 4 of these individually, I can just do a pattern feature. You can see in this case, I've made the first one up top here, and then I'm going to do a mirror feature in order to mirror those over to the other side, just to get an idea for what this is going to look like. So now I can grab one of these bodies here and I can save it as a mesh, which I can import into my 3D printing software. If you're not familiar with 3D printing, this is a slicer program, and what it does is it takes our 3D model and it determines how it can make it slice by slice as it goes through and writes all the G code that is then sent to the machine. There's tons of different parameters that we can configure, and these parameters change based off the material that we're going to be using, which in this case, we're going to be using ABS. If we go ahead and slice our plate here and we zoom in, we can actually step through this process layer by layer, and we can see how the machine is actually going to make our part. If I carefully organize these here, I think I can actually print 2 of these at a time. And you can see to make 2 of these is going to take me about 38 minutes, but I can of course be working on something else while the 3D printer is doing its thing. So on the 3D printer, I was able to print 2 of these at a time, and I only imported the one model for the one side, and then I just mirrored it in the 3D printing software in order to create my other side. But here we have our pieces now ready for addition to the enclosure. I did want to point out that slight design detail that we added where there is a slight pocket in the top of this. Again, that would be something that would be difficult to do, especially at that small scale, with normal woodworking procedures without using a CNC machine. To affix these to the enclosure itself, I'm not going to be doing anything too wild. It would be cool to use a CNC machine and plan for this earlier in the design and perhaps make sort of a pocket for the piece to fit into. But in this case, I want to make sure that I line up with our previous dimensions. As an example, we want to make sure that the center of the bottom one is 7 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom of the enclosure. I need to sketch out some lines here manually. I've got the enclosure sitting here on the floor on a piece of padding, and it is on its back, and the back of this enclosure is angled to match the rear of the seat angle. So it makes things a little bit more challenging here. I'm gonna be working at an angle, but let's get those lines sketched. So our first center line needs to be 7 1/8 inches away from the bottom. Draw in that center line. And my next center line will be 8 3/4 inches right there. And this is the center line location, which means that line is going to be hidden. I know that I've designed these to be a 1/2 inch thick, so I'm going to do an offset of a 1/4 inch on each side of each of these center lines. Finally, I just need to measure my end offset to know where to line these up in relation to the end of the board here. So that's easy enough to add as well. I, of course, wanted to do a quick little test fit here in the vehicle to make sure these line up as intended, because once I glue those pieces on the enclosure, it's going to be really hard to get them off. And in that case, we are looking good. To glue these in place, I'm going to be using some of the Mobile Solutions CA glue. In this case, I'm going with the thick consistency. What's nice about this is it does give me a few seconds of working time, so I can apply this to the back of each of the pieces. I can carefully line everything up, and then to lock everything in place, I'll use the instant activator. Now guys, I did want to point out a little bit of a mistake I made here so that you guys can avoid this. I did put a little bit too much adhesive on this first piece that I attached, the first rib here, and it did kind of ooze out the sides. No big deal, it's obviously still going to hold in place. but I do want to remove that slight amount of ooze. So I definitely want to make sure that I have a good respirator on, because you do not want to inhale any of the CA glue dust when you sand it, but I'm going to slightly sand that away. Back to the floor here so that we can easily work on the port section. If you guys recall in the previous video, what I did is I intentionally took a roundover bit and I sunk it a little bit extra into the material, which leaves an ever so slight lip right here that I'm catching my nail on. The advantage of that lip is it allowed me to put some painter's tape around the outside of the port and precisely line up and cut the edges. That way I could paint the inside on this front board. But now we're going to use that lip once again so that we can protect our painted area from the coating that we are about to apply. So first, I'll carefully stick this tape in place. I kind of tuck it down into the corners using my fingernail. And then using that light groove there, it's really easy to trim it perfectly away. And since this special coating that I'm going to be applying does have a tendency to kind of splatter a little bit, I do want to make sure that I completely cover up the port here, not just the edges. Again, the coating can get messy, so I like to protect my work surface, which in this case is the floor because of the size of this enclosure. And you can see I'm using these. This is critical. I know this seems like simple things, but this will save you a ton of time and effort and avoid mistakes. I raised the enclosure up on purpose so that I can have the material kind of wrap around the bottom without having it get stuck to my cardboard or whatever is protecting the work surface. Now, I also want to avoid getting the coating on our mounting flange here. I want that to be nice and smooth so that I get a nice airtight seal. So I'm going to mask those off as well. Same thing again on the tape. I'll work it into the corner and then use a blade to precisely cut it away. Now that we have the enclosure completely prepped, we're going to be using this material right here. This is Duratex, and this is formulated specifically for being a speaker cabinet coating. I've used this material on my last few projects with great results. It's super durable, and honestly, it's really easy to apply. What is important is to use a texture roller like this one here that is going to give us that grain as we apply it. And it's also good to have a chip brush on hand. That way we can work the material down into the corners. When I say the corners, I mean areas like this around this subwoofer cutout. In my experience, the Duratex has quite a bit of working time, which is great because you don't have to be worried about moving super fast. But when it is wet, I do find that it gives off a bit of a smell. So I like to make sure that I'm also wearing a respirator. So I allowed everything to dry, and then I flipped this enclosure over so that I could also coat the bottom. I always like to go for full coverage, and here is now what we have for our finished box. I'm really happy with the way that these 3D printed accents turned out, and I also like the way that the texture coating added a bit of texture even to those flat surfaces. I think in the future that I want to try using these 3D printed accents even under upholstery and see how that turns out. I'm also really happy with all the transition areas between the texture coating and where we applied that flat black paint. Especially with the subwoofers added in place, this enclosure really has a nice finished look. Now you may have noticed that we have not yet added any speaker terminals to this enclosure, any way for the wiring to be connected to the subwoofers, and that's because we're going to be using this, but I want to create more of a 3D printed solution that's going to allow this to work even better. If you're new here and you want to make sure that you catch that video, I'd love to have you as a subscriber. For selecting car audio gear for your next system, don't forget to check out our show sponsor, Crutchfield, that makes the process easy. You can learn more and save on your next qualifying purchase with the links down in the video description. A big thanks to them, along with Jerry and the rest of the Patreon membership team, for making these videos possible, and thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching.